Hi there everyone, and a very warm welcome to this new series on reading music notation. Now, there are many different forms of music notation, some that we've already looked at in some of our videos, including notation for Western classical music, and also forms of notation that are more modern for guitars and drums and other types of music from around the world. Now, in this series, we're probably not going to be able to have a look at all of these, but there are some things that most of these forms of music notation have in common, and they're really important for us to understand before we go about starting to learn them. So before we get started having a look at the nuts and bolts of music notation, I just thought it would be useful to explore some of the things that music notation is and what it can do for us, and some of the things that music notation is not and what it can't do for us. These are really useful and important to remember as we go forward. So perhaps most importantly, what is music notation for? Well, I would say that music notation is probably the best way to store and remember musical ideas. These might be musical ideas that we've had ourselves, or it gives us the opportunity to learn about and explore for ourselves the musical ideas of other people. It's important to remember that for most of history we didn't have the recording technology that we do today. So for many centuries, writing down musical ideas on paper was the only method that the composers had to store and preserve their ideas. But even now in the 21st century, when we do have a huge array of recorded music that we can listen to, music notation is still very useful, particularly for us as students of music. Because while it's great to listen to recordings, sometimes we can learn a huge amount of detail from looking at the score of the piece of music that's been recorded. Sometimes it's difficult to hear exactly what notes are in chords. Sometimes it's quite difficult to hear exactly how the composer intended the music to be performed in terms of dynamics, tempo, and even sometimes exactly what instruments were supposed to be performing. Music notation helps us get under the bonnet of music, and so as a result it can teach us a huge amount and have a great influence on our own compositions. Almost all the great composers, from Mozart and Beethoven to Paul McCartney and Jimi Hendrix, all took a huge amount of time to explore and learn about the music that they really admired from the past. So even if we just learn a few skills in reading music, this can open up a whole world of fantastic music for us to explore. Another really important feature of sheet music, or notated music, is that it's very useful for getting big groups of musicians to play together. You may have seen an enormous orchestra with 100 or even more players all playing together. Now I'm sure it's possible with enough effort and enough practice to get a group of 100 or more musicians playing together without any sheet music or music notation. However, the addition of simple sheet music can help a group of musicians very quickly start to work together and produce fantastic music. Certainly, there's nothing I can recommend more than being a member of an orchestra, a choir, or a large group of musicians. Any kind of large group of musicians, from a samba band to an enormous drumming group. So learning how to read music can help you join in with all of this and have fantastic experiences playing or singing with large groups of musicians. Now, while this list doesn't contain all the useful things that music notation can do for us, one final fantastic thing it can be is a method to spread music to a wide audience. Again, don't forget that in the past we didn't have the ability to upload our music to YouTube or record it onto a CD. So if a composer wanted to earn a living from selling his or her music, then chances are he would need a publisher to print his music out and send it to people all around the world. The 16th century, for example, is a really interesting time in the history of music, because in 1501 the first ever printed music appeared in the world. In the previous century, the 15th century, Gutenberg had invented the printing press, and it didn't take long for musicians to start to adapt this technology to the sorts of printing that they needed to do to write down their musical ideas on paper. Once this happened, music very quickly spread right the way across Europe. And certainly you would start to hear Italian music in France, French music in Germany, and German music in the United Kingdom. So it's quite probable that we have music notation to thank for the incredible range, breadth and diversity of music that we have available to us today. So I hope you'll agree with me at this point that it's quite clear there's lots of good reasons why learning some music notation is a really good idea. But this has to come with a word of warning from me, because I think there's a lot of times when music notation can be less helpful, and actually stop us being as creative as perhaps we could be. So to complete this video, I'd like to take you through some of the things that music notation is not, to try and stop you falling into the kinds of traps that I've seen many students fall into before. Most importantly, music notation is not the whole story about a piece of music. All the information that you need to put on a fantastic performance of a piece of music is not contained in the lines, dots, and other markings on the page. While these can be a very useful reminder and a very good guide to help us learn the music, we as musicians have to put a huge amount of our own creativity and imagination into producing the finished performance of any piece of music, whether it's notated or not notated. The way, of course, that all of us can learn how to add all this extra stuff that's not included in the music notation just comes from a huge amount of listening, which hopefully all of us are doing anyway because it's an incredible amount of fun. Second most important is that learning to read music is not a replacement for being musical. I've seen so many students who, as a result of having fantastic music reading skills, can play to you any piece of music from a piece of paper that you choose for them. Yeah. I've seen so many students who, through fantastic music notation reading skills, can play you any piece of music of any complexity that you ask for. But actually, that's pretty much where their ability with music stops. Because as they've become brilliant at reading music, they've kind of never learnt about how music actually works along the way. Now, my intention for you guys is to not just learn how to play music, but I want you to be able to start playing with music. I want you to be able to compose music for yourself, maybe take other people's music and change it, rearrange it and make it your own, and also just enjoy the fact that you can build your own structures out of music, and love the fact that it's not very difficult. While learning music notation might be a really important part of this process, much more important to this is developing your ears, developing your sense of musicality, and also just learning about how music works. These are far more important, and we will be dealing with all of this stuff in future videos. You never want to become the student who has just played a fantastic piece of complex music that they've learnt from a piece of sheet music. But then when someone comes up to them and says, "It's my birthday today, can you play me Happy Birthday?" they don't know where to start, because they don't know even the most basic building blocks of how music works. So with that little rant over, here's another important thing to remember about music notation. And that is, it's not required to become a creative musician. There have been many, many musicians throughout history that didn't ever learn how to read music. That might just have been because they developed fantastic ears and were able to hear exactly what they needed from other people playing music to them. And it's also important to remember that in some styles of music, sheet music reading skills are more important than in others. As I said before, if you want to play in an orchestra, which I can hugely recommend, then you're probably going to need to learn some kind of sheet music reading skills, because otherwise you won't be able to play along with the rest of the group. Other people who play in pop, rock, folk and jazz ensembles sometimes don't learn how to read music or learn to read a different form of music notation, because don't forget the most important thing about being a musician is being musical, not which type of music notation you're able to read. And finally, perhaps the most important thing to remember about what music notation is not, is that music notation is not hard to learn. Most people within a couple of lessons can get a good grasp of the basic concepts that sit behind most forms of music notation, not just standard Western classical sheet music, but also many of the other different types of sheet music that have emerged over the last 100 years or so. So I think it's about time we stop talking about it and get started learning about how to read some simple sheet music.